In the autumn of 1903, in the flat, wind-scoured expanse of Pembina County, North Dakota, a quiet Norwegian immigrant named Niels Andersen began a project that baffled his neighbors. The land here was unforgiving, a vast tabletop under an immense sky, and survival was a matter of grim, established calculus. You built your cabin stout, chinked it tight against the coming winter, and you cut a mountain of wood. Every man in the sparse settlement of Walhalla followed this rhythm. They spent their days with the bite of the axe and the groan of the saw, their woodpiles growing into formidable bulwarks against the inevitable siege of cold. They worked with a communal and competitive fervor, their efforts a public ledger of their foresight and industry. But Niels Andersen did not. While his neighbors' axes rang out in a steady chorus, Niels's labor was quieter, stranger. He worked not with an axe, but with a spade. Day after day, under the crisp, indifferent blue of the autumn sky, he dug a trench. It was not a foundation for a new barn, nor a root cellar, though it had the deep, deliberate look of both. It began near the eastern wall of his modest, well-kept cabin and snaked out across his small plot of land for over 100 feet, a long earthen scar on the prairie grass. His neighbors would pause their work, leaning on their axe handles, and watch him. They saw him hauling sections of heavy, vitrified clay pipe, the kind used for town sewers or agricultural drainage, and carefully laying them in the bottom of his deep furrow. Thomas Miller, a man whose family had homesteaded the area a generation before and who considered himself a pillar of local common sense, was the first to voice the collective confusion. He strode over one afternoon, his boots crunching on the dry soil. "Niels," he began, his tone a mixture of genuine curiosity and condescension. "That's a powerful lot of digging. If you're looking for water, you're a bit high on the terrain." Niels looked up from his work, his face beaded with sweat despite the cool air. He was a man of few words, his English still carrying the lilting cadence of his homeland. "Not for water, Thomas," he said simply, before turning back to fitting two sections of the wide-mouthed pipe together. Miller watched for a moment longer, then walked away, shaking his head. The verdict spread quickly through the small community, whispered over fences, and discussed at the general store. They called it Niels's folly. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. "He's burying a drain pipe to nowhere," one farmer scoffed. "He's spending his time digging when he should be chopping." They saw the strange metal hood he fashioned over the far end of the pipe, rising just a few feet from the ground, and the meticulous way he connected the other end through his cabin's thick stone foundation, terminating it in a small, sealed wooden box near his cast-iron stove. "It's a fence around a house," another joked, misinterpreting the far-off intake for some kind of bizarre property marker. The mockery was not malicious, not entirely. It was the simple, unthinking judgment of a people who believed they had already perfected the art of survival in this place. Their methods were tried and true, passed down through hard-won experience. Niels's project fit nowhere in their lexicon of practical wisdom. That winter, the winter of 1903 to 1904, would enter the annals of regional history as a season of profound and brutal cold. A series of blizzards, which the old-timers would later call the Great White Death, swept down from the Arctic, burying the landscape under feet of fine, wind-driven snow and plunging temperatures to levels that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. In the cabins of Thomas Miller and his neighbors, the conventional wisdom failed. Their tightly chinked walls, could not stop the insidious infiltration of a cold so intense it created its own pressure, sucking the warmth out through every microscopic crack. Their stoves, fighting for air in the sealed rooms, sputtered and backdrafted, filling their homes with acrid smoke. They burned through their monumental woodpiles at an astonishing rate, yet the cold remained, a palpable, life-threatening presence. But inside Niels Anderson's small cabin, something was different. While the wind shrieked outside, his stove burned with a clean, steady, unwavering flame. His single room was a sanctuary of calm, breathable warmth. His woodpile seemed barely to shrink. What did he understand about the simple, powerful physics of air pressure and thermal dynamics that everyone else dismissed as foolish, and that was now the only thing standing between life and death on the frozen Dakota prairie? The answer lay buried, both in the North Dakota soil and in the memories Niels Anderson carried from his home across the sea. He was born and raised not in the bustling ports of Christiania, but in the high, remote valleys of central Norway, a place where winter was not a season but the default state of the world. There, building was an act of profound respect for the power of cold, wind, and snow. He had grown up in a house built into the lee of a hill, its lower levels banked with earth, its windows small and strategically placed. He remembered the old farmhouses with their central hearths and complex flue systems designed not just to vent smoke, but to circulate warmth. His grandfather, a man who built with the wisdom of generations, had taught him a fundamental principle. "The earth has a slow, deep breath," the old man would say, his hands tracing lines in the dirt. "In the deepest winter, it exhales a little warmth. In the hottest summer, it exhales a little cool. A wise man listens to that breath and invites it into his home." As a boy, Niels had seen this principle in action. He had played in the cool, dry root cellars that never froze, even when the ground above was like iron. He had marveled at the Jordkeller, the earth cellars dug deep into hillsides, used for storing not just potatoes, but barrels of milk and cured meats, maintaining a stable temperature year-round, protected by the immense thermal mass of the planet itself. This traditional knowledge was later sharpened by practical, industrial experience. Before staking his claim in North Dakota, Niels had spent 2 years working in Minnesota for a company that harvested ice from the Great Northern Lakes. His job had been to help construct the massive ice houses, cavernous wooden structures designed to keep thousands of tons of frozen water solid through the heat of July and August. There, he learned the science of insulation in a very direct way. He learned about sawdust and wood shavings as fill. He learned about the critical importance of a vapor barrier to keep the insulation dry. But most importantly, he learned about the concept of dead air. He saw how the most effective ice houses were built with double walls, the space between them creating a buffer that dramatically slowed the transfer of heat. Air, he realized, was a phenomenal insulator, but only if it was trapped and still. Moving air, convection, was the great enemy of warmth. A final piece of the puzzle fell into place during his first year in Dakota Territory. While trapping for furs to earn extra money, he had met a Métis man named Joseph Riel, a seasoned hunter whose knowledge of the local environment was as deep as the prairie soil. One day, seeking shelter from a sudden squall, they had shared a small fire near the entrance to a badger's den. Niels, ever observant, noted the faint, steady wisp of steam rising from the hole, even though the animal was deep inside. He asked Joseph about it. The old trapper smiled. "The badger is a wise builder," he explained. He digs his tunnels long and deep. The air that reaches his sleeping room has traveled far underground. The earth warms it for him. He breathes the ground's air, not the wind's. Joseph explained how many burrowing animals survive the winter, not just through hibernation, but through the passive geothermal moderation of their dens. The long, deep tunnels acted as primitive heat exchangers. These three streams of knowledge, the traditional wisdom of his Norwegian ancestors, the industrial science of the Minnesota ice houses, and the ecological insight of the Métis trapper, converged in Niels's mind. He began to form a clear picture of the physics at play. The Earth, several feet below the frost line, maintained a remarkably constant temperature, roughly between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. This was the principle of geothermal stability. Any air that could be made to travel through this stable subterranean environment would have its temperature moderated. In the dead of winter, minus 30-degree air entering a long, buried pipe would be warmed to 40 degrees by the time it reached its destination. In the summer, 90-degree air would be cooled to that same stable temperature. He also understood the problem of his neighbors' cabins. A wood stove requires a tremendous amount of air for proper combustion. In a well-sealed house, the stove would consume the available oxygen and create a powerful negative pressure, a vacuum. This vacuum would then desperately pull replacement air from wherever it could find it, through the tiniest gaps in the window frames, under the door, between the logs of the walls. This was the source of the bone-chilling drafts that made their homes so uncomfortable and inefficient. The air being pulled in was the same brutally cold air from outside, forcing the stove to work even harder in a self-defeating cycle. Niels's idea was an elegant, radical solution. He would give his stove its own dedicated source of air, a direct line to the outside. But instead of a simple short pipe that would just feed it frozen air, he would use his long buried earth tube. His stove would draw its combustion air through the 100-foot-long clay pipe. That air, pre-warmed by the earth to a consistent 40 degrees, would allow the stove to burn at peak efficiency. More importantly, because the stove was no longer sucking air from the living space, the negative pressure inside the cabin would disappear. The house would be balanced. The insidious, heat-robbing drafts would cease to exist. The cabin would no longer be fighting the outside air. It would be sealed off from it, breathing a separate, tempered breath drawn from the deep, slow respiration of the earth itself. His folly was, in fact, a sophisticated passive heat exchanger, a ground-coupled air intake system born from centuries of accumulated wisdom. The construction of this system was a testament to Niels Andersen's methodical nature. The project began in late September, when the ground was still workable, but the harvest was largely complete. He started by marking his line with stakes and twine, ensuring a consistent, gentle slope away from the cabin. This was crucial. The slope would allow any condensation that formed inside the pipe to drain harmlessly away from his foundation. He chose a path that ran east, away from the prevailing northwesterly winter winds, to minimize the chance of the intake hood being buried by drifting snow. The digging was the most arduous part. The prairie topsoil was rich but thin, quickly giving way to dense, heavy clay. Niels worked with a long-handled spade and a mattock, his movements economical and rhythmic. He did not rush. He dug a trench 3 feet wide and aimed for a depth of nearly 8 feet. His neighbors, passing by on their wagons, saw the growing mound of dark earth and marveled at the sheer physical effort. "He'll have dug himself to China by Christmas," Thomas Miller remarked to his wife, a line that was repeated with amusement around the settlement. Niels paid them no mind. He understood that depth was not arbitrary. It was essential to get below the frost line and into the zone of stable geothermal temperature. Once the trench was complete, a long, deep channel stretching away from his home, the careful work of laying the pipe began. He had purchased 12-inch diameter vitrified clay, bell, and spigot pipes, each section 3 feet long. These were expensive, representing a significant portion of his savings from the previous year's trapping. This was another source of the community's ridicule, the perceived waste of good money. He lowered each heavy section into the trench with ropes and a simple wooden tripod, meticulously aligning them. At each joint, where the spigot end of one pipe fit into the bell end of the next, he applied a thick, sticky layer of oakum, a tarred fiber, and then sealed it with a mortar of cement and sand. He was creating a single, contiguous, airtight tube. This was not a drainage pipe meant to be porous. It had to be as sealed as a lung. Where the pipe met his cabin, he had already prepared the way. Using a star drill and a heavy sledgehammer, he had painstakingly chipped a hole through the 2-foot-thick fieldstone foundation he had laid years before. The opening was just below the level of the interior floor joists. He angled the final section of pipe slightly upwards as it entered the house, another precaution against any potential backflow of moisture. Inside the crawl space, he connected the clay pipe to a square-section duct he had fabricated from galvanized tin. This duct ran up through the floor and terminated in a plenum, a small, airtight wooden box measuring about 2 feet square, which he built directly behind his potbelly stove. From this box, a smaller 6-inch flexible metal duct connected directly to a custom-made air intake collar he had bolted onto the back of the stove. The entire pathway, from the intake hood 100 feet away to the firebox of his stove, was a closed system. Finally, he addressed the intake. Out at the far end of the trench, he fashioned a vertical riser, bringing the opening of the pipe about 4 feet above the ground. To protect it from rain, snow, and nesting animals, he built a simple but effective hood from hammered tin, shaped like a downward-facing cone, with a wide mesh screen of galvanized wire across the opening. It was this strange metallic mushroom in the middle of his field that drew the most pointed comments. Throughout this process, Thomas Miller acted as the unofficial spokesman for the community's skepticism. He would often stop by, ostensibly to be neighborly, but truly to gawk at the strange endeavor. "Now, Niels," he said one afternoon, gesturing at the nearly completed trench, "I've built 3 houses in this territory. The way to stay warm is a high ceiling to let the bad air rise, and a good tight wall. You cut enough wood, you'll be fine. All this," he waved his hand dismissively, "this is just putting cold dirt next to your house. It'll leach the heat right out of your foundation." Miller's argument was based on the local common sense. High ceilings were considered a mark of a good home, a place for smoke and stuffy air to gather, far away from the inhabitants. And everyone knew that contact with the earth made things cold. It was why they built cellars. The idea of using the earth to create warmth seemed like a complete inversion of logic. Niels, wiping his hands on a rag, offered a quiet rebuttal. He had already calculated the fuel savings in his head, an estimate based on the efficiency gains he anticipated. "The stove needs to breathe, Thomas," he explained patiently. "Right now, your stove breathes the air you're trying to heat. It's like a man trying to run a race while holding his own breath. I am giving my stove its own breath, from the earth." Miller just shook his head, a smirk on his face. "Well, I hope your stove enjoys the taste of dirt, Niels," I'll stick to good oak." He walked away, confident in his proven methods. Niels did not try to argue further. He knew that explanations were useless against the wall of ingrained belief. Proof was the only language that would be understood. He finished his work, carefully backfilling the entire length of the trench, tamping the earth down in layers to ensure it was well compacted. By the time the first snows of November began to fly, the only visible evidence of his immense labor was the small, metal-capped pipe standing sentinel in the field and the subtle depression in the ground that marked the path of his buried tube. He ignored the last of the season's commentary, the lingering jokes about his prairie snorkel. He simply went about his other chores, securing his livestock, banking the foundation with straw, and waiting with a quiet and unshakable confidence for the test he knew was coming. The test arrived in the second week of January, 1904. It began not with snow, but with an unnatural stillness and a precipitous drop in temperature. The sky turned a strange, luminous gray, and the air grew so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. Then the wind came, a low moan from the northwest that quickly escalated into a high, violent shriek. The snow followed, not in flakes, but as a fine, granular powder, like sand, driven almost horizontally by the gale. The settlers called this a ground blizzard, and it was the most dangerous kind. It didn't just fall, it scoured, erased, and buried. Within hours, the world outside the small cabins of Pembina County had vanished into a churning vortex of white. The temperature, recorded at the nearest railway depot before the telegraph lines went down, was 28 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. But the wind, gusting to over 50 miles per hour, created a wind chill that was functionally immeasurable and instantly lethal. For the families huddled in their conventionally built homes, the assault was immediate and terrifying. Inside Thomas Miller's two-room cabin, the reality of the storm's physics set in. He had a large, modern cast-iron stove, the best money could buy, and he fed it with seasoned oak from his massive woodpile. But the stove, which normally roared with life, now seemed to struggle. The fire burned with a low, orange, smoky flame. Puffs of acrid smoke would periodically billow out from the stove's joints as the wind gusted, a phenomenon known as backdrafting. The room was hazy and smelled of soot. His wife, Mary, was constantly coughing, her eyes watering. Their two young children were bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pale. The problem was air. The cabin, which Miller had so proudly chinked with oakum and daubing, was now too airtight for its own good. The ravenous fire was consuming oxygen, creating a powerful vacuum inside the small structure. The laws of physics demanded that this vacuum be filled, and so the storm found its way in. Freezing, minus 28-degree air shrieked through the keyhole of the front door. It whistled around the frames of the two small windows, forming thick, fern-like patterns of frost on the interior of the glass. It seeped in at the corners where the log walls met, invisible but potent streams of absolute cold. To stand within a foot of any wall was to feel a constant, draining chill. Miller could feel the draft on the back of his neck no matter where he sat. He was burning wood at a frantic pace, yet the thermometer on the interior wall barely climbed above the freezing mark. The heat from his stove was being sucked up the chimney and simultaneously defeated by the constant, overwhelming infiltration of cold air. His fortress was under siege from within. His fuel, the symbol of his foresight, was being rendered useless. 3 miles away, inside Niels Anderson's cabin, the scene was entirely different. The storm howled outside, a sound of cosmic fury, but inside, an almost impossible calm prevailed. His smaller potbelly stove glowed with a steady, reassuring cherry-red heat. The fire within burned with a bright, clean, yellow-white flame, dancing vigorously. There was no smoke, no smell of soot. The air was warm and remarkably fresh. The thermometer hanging on his wall, far from the stove, registered a stable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The physics of success were as simple and elegant as the physics of Miller's failure. Niels's stove was not fighting for air. It was breathing deeply and easily through the 100-foot earth tube. Down in the frozen field, the wind screamed over the metal intake hood, forcing frigid air down into the clay pipe. As that -28-degree air began its journey 8 feet underground, it immediately came into contact with the pipe walls, which were being held at a constant 40-some degrees by the thermal mass of the surrounding earth. Heat transferred from the warmer earth to the colder air. Over the course of its 100-foot journey, the air temperature was raised by nearly 70 degrees. By the time it entered the plenum box behind Niels's stove, it was a steady, reliable 40 degrees. This pre-warmed air fed the fire, allowing for perfect, efficient combustion. But the masterstroke was the effect on the cabin itself. Because the stove's air supply was a closed system, it created no vacuum within the living space. The pressure inside the cabin was neutral, perfectly balanced with the pressure outside. With no vacuum to draw it in, the outside air stayed outside. There were no drafts. The seals around his windows and door were not being tested by a desperate, air-sucking void. The chinking in his walls was not being forced to repel an invisible invasion. His home was an island of thermal integrity, using a fraction of the fuel to maintain a comfortable temperature because it was not engaged in a futile, continuous war with the cold. He had not just built a home, he had engineered a microclimate. While his neighbors were fighting a battle of brute force, burning mountains of wood to heat the drafts, Niels was winning with intelligence, using the very earth as his ally. As the first day of the blizzard bled into the second, Niels Anderson moved with a quiet, deliberate mien. He was not merely surviving, he was observing. He had a small ledger book and a pencil, and every few hours he would make a series of notations. First, he tapped the glass of the spirit thermometer hanging on the far wall, 65 degrees. He noted the time. Then he went outside, a journey of only a few feet into the small, sheltered woodshed attached to the cabin's lee side. He counted the logs he had brought in and placed by the stove. He had used only 6 logs in the past 12 hours. He made a note of this. His woodpile, which his neighbors had deemed pitifully small, now seemed almost laughably abundant. He performed another simple test. Lighting a splinter of wood and blowing it out, he held the smoking stick near the bottom of his door and then near the window frames. The thin ribbon of smoke rose perfectly straight, undisturbed. It did not waver or curl, offering silent, visual proof of what he already felt: the complete absence of drafts. This was not just a feeling of comfort. It was data. It was measurable, empirical evidence of his system's success. His vindication was not a matter of pride, but of physics. He was a scientist in his own small, life-saving laboratory. The situation in Thomas Miller's home and in the handful of other cabins scattered across the township had grown dire. By the third day, the temperature inside their homes hovered near freezing. They had been feeding their stoves constantly for over 60 hours, and their once mighty woodpiles were alarmingly depleted. The relentless wind had scoured the snow into massive drifts, making any trip to an unsheltered woodpile a life-threatening expedition. Miller had already burned through his main supply and was now starting on the green, unseasoned wood he had set aside for the following year. It hissed and sputtered, producing more smoke than heat. Desperation began to set in. To supplement the poor quality wood, he had broken up a wooden crate. Next would be a spare chair. The smoke in the cabin was now thick and punishing, and his youngest child, a boy of 4, was breathing with a shallow, rattling cough. The baby, swaddled in a crib near the stove, was listless. Mary's face was a mask of fear. They were losing. The cold was an enemy that did not tire, and their resources were finite. It was in this moment of stark terror that Thomas Miller thought of the fool, Niels Anderson. He pictured Niels's strange pipe and his ridiculously small woodpile. A desperate, illogical thought bloomed in his mind. What if the fool was not a fool at all? The thought was so powerful it spurred him to action. "I'm going to check on Niels," he announced, his voice hoarse. Mary pleaded with him not to go, but he was resolute. He had to see. He had to know. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and canvas he owned, wrapped a scarf over his face until only his eyes were visible, and plunged out into the white maelstrom. The force of the wind knocked him back a step. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. He could see nothing beyond a few feet. He navigated by memory and instinct, moving from the corner of his cabin to the fence line, his hand on the wire, pulling himself along against the gale. The 3 miles to Niels's cabin felt like 100. He fell multiple times into deep, soft drifts, the snow packing into his clothes, melting and then freezing. By the time he saw the faint, blurry outline of Niels's cabin, a dim, welcoming square of yellow light in the swirling chaos, he was exhausted, half frozen, and on the verge of collapse. He stumbled to the door and hammered on it with his gloved fist. When the door opened, the first thing that struck him was not the light, but the air. A wave of clean, dry, steady warmth washed over him, devoid of any scent of smoke. He staggered inside, and Niels quickly shut the door behind him. Miller stood there, swaying, as his frozen body began to register the profound difference. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his skin numb and white. His eyes, accustomed to the hazy gloom of his own home, took in the scene. The brightly burning stove, the clear air, the feeling of profound and impossible peace. Niels was sitting at his small table, his ledger open. There was no sense of smugness on his face, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet concern. "Thomas," Niels said, his voice calm, "you are in a bad way. Sit." Niels helped him to a chair near the stove and gave him a cup of hot coffee. For a long time, Miller could not speak. He simply sat, soaking in the warmth, his body trembling as the feeling returned to his extremities. He looked around the small, single room. It was a sanctuary. Finally, he looked at Niels, his eyes filled with a dawning, humbling realization. His gaze drifted to the floor near the stove, to the tin duct that rose from the crawl space. "How?" Miller asked, his voice a ragged whisper. "There is no draft. The air, it is clean." Niels simply pointed to the duct. "The stove breathes from the earth," he said. It was the same explanation he had offered months ago, but now the words landed with the force of revelation. Miller nodded slowly, the full, staggering weight of his own folly and Niels's wisdom crashing down upon him. He had not come seeking rescue, only answers, but he had found salvation. Without another word needing to be spoken, he knew his family had to come here. Niels, seeing the look in his eyes, simply nodded. He would help. His grace was as steady and unwavering as the warmth in his home. The rescue was a perilous affair, but it was undertaken with Niels's methodical planning. After allowing Thomas Miller an hour to recover, they prepared for the journey back. Niels provided Miller with drier, warmer mittens and a different kind of face covering, a simple leather mask with eye slits he had made, which was less prone to freezing up with condensed breath. They took a coil of rope. Battling their way back to Miller's cabin, they tied the rope from Niels's door to Miller's, creating a lifeline in the blinding whiteout. One by one, they brought the family across. First, Mary, carrying the infant wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, her face a mixture of terror and astonished relief as she entered Niels's haven of warmth. Then, with Miller's help, Niels carried the feverish 4-year-old boy. Within hours, Niels Anderson's small cabin held not just its owner, but the entire Miller family, and, by the next day, 2 other families from nearby homesteads who had seen the traffic and followed the rope line out of desperation. The space was crowded, but it was alive. The stove, fed its steady diet of pre-warmed air, handled the increased demand for warmth with quiet efficiency. The air remained fresh, the temperature stable. For the refugees, the contrast was a miracle. They had come from homes that had become smoke-filled ice boxes, where the very air was a hostile presence. Here, they could breathe. The children's coughs subsided. The color returned to their faces. They were safe. In the quiet hours of the storm's final day, Thomas Miller, his family sleeping peacefully around him, sat with Niels by the stove. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep and humble curiosity. He was no longer the skeptic. He was the student. "Show me again," he would say, pointing to the plenum box. "The air comes from where?" And Niels, patient and generous, would sketch the entire system on a piece of slate. He drew the long trench, the sloped pipe, the intake hood. He explained the frost line, the stable earth temperature, the principle of negative pressure. He spoke not of his own cleverness, but of the simple, undeniable laws of nature he had merely chosen to obey. Miller listened, his brow furrowed in concentration, absorbing every detail. He was not just learning how to build a strange contraption. He was unlearning a lifetime of flawed assumptions. He was witnessing a paradigm shift in the art of survival, and he knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. When the great blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world transformed, silent, and buried under a deep blanket of white, the story of Niels Anderson's cabin spread like wildfire through the shell-shocked community. It was told first by Thomas Miller, a man whose word carried weight. He described the suffocating smoke and the insidious cold of his own home, and then he spoke of Niels's cabin with a reverence that silenced any remaining trace of mockery. He spoke of the clean air, the steady, draft-free warmth, and the shockingly small amount of wood it consumed. Soon, a procession of neighbors made their way to Niels's homestead. They came not to gawk, but to learn. They stood in his warm room, felt the lack of drafts, and saw with their own eyes the small, efficient fire. They peppered him with questions. Niels, a man who had been an outcast, was suddenly the most respected expert in the county. He answered every question with simple, direct honesty. He held no grudges. He showed them the ledger where he had tracked his fuel use and temperature, turning anecdotal success into hard data. That spring, as the monumental snows melted and the prairie turned green again, a new kind of work began in Pembina County. Under Niels Anderson's quiet guidance, a community-wide project got underway. Thomas Miller was the first. He hired 2 men to help him dig a trench, following the exact principles Niels had laid out. He laid vitrified clay pipe, sealing the joints with the same meticulous care. Other families followed suit. The sight of men digging long, strange trenches became a common one that summer. The project became a symbol of a shared lesson, learned the hardest way possible. They called the system the Anderson Pipe, or, more simply, the Dakota Breath. Niels moved from homestead to homestead, acting as a consultant. He helped one family adapt the design to their larger 2-story house, running a wider pipe to a larger plenum that fed 2 separate stoves. He advised another on how to route a pipe around a large granite boulder they found in their path. He taught them the importance of the slope for drainage and the necessity of a sealed system. The innovation was not just copied, it was understood. The principle was robust and adaptable, and the community embraced it wholeheartedly. Niels's folly had become the new standard of frontier engineering. The following winter provided the ultimate proof of the system's worth. It was a cold winter, though not as brutally severe as the one before. But the difference in the retrofitted homes was dramatic and measurable. Families reported cutting their wood consumption by half, and in some cases by 2/3. The health of the community saw a marked improvement. The local school teacher, a curious and observant woman named Eleanor Vance, who had documented the events of the blizzard in her journal, noted a significant decrease in the winter ailments that had always plagued the settlement. The persistent winter cough that so often afflicts the young children seems to have all but vanished from the homes which have installed Mr. Anderson's ventilation system, she wrote. The air within is palpably cleaner and more wholesome. The most vulnerable members of the community, the infants and the elderly, thrived. An elderly man who had nearly perished in the great blizzard survived the following winter with ease, his daughter crediting the breathing pipe that kept their small home warm and draft-free. The innovation wasn't just about comfort or saving fuel. It was demonstrably saving lives. It was a legacy of survival, written not in stone monuments, but in the quiet, healthy breaths of a grateful community. The quiet Norwegian immigrant had not just warmed their homes, he had fundamentally improved their chances at life on the harsh, beautiful prairie. The story of the Dakota Breath did not remain confined to the small settlement of Walhalla. Eleanor Vance, the schoolteacher, was a methodical chronicler. She saw the profound importance of what Niels had accomplished. Over the course of the next year, she corresponded with Niels, with Thomas Miller, and with other families, gathering data, drawings, and testimonials. She compiled her research into a detailed article, complete with diagrams Niels had helped her draw. She titled it, "A System for the Passive Tempering and Provision of Combustion, Air for Dwellings in Cold Climates, as devised by Mr. Niels Anderson." She sent the article not to a local newspaper, but to the American Agriculturist, a widely read national journal for farmers and homesteaders. In the spring of 1906, it was published. The idea, once a subject of local ridicule, was now disseminated across the country. Letters began to arrive in Pembina County, addressed simply to Niels Anderson, the inventor of the Anderson pipe. They came from homesteaders in Montana, ranchers in Wyoming, and farmers in Minnesota, people living on the knife's edge of survival in other cold climates. They asked for clarifications, for more detailed plans, for advice. Niels, with the help of Thomas Miller and Eleanor Vance, answered every one. The simple, elegant principle of the earth tube began to spread. A quiet revolution in vernacular architecture passed from one homesteader to another. This historical footnote, this small story of frontier ingenuity, is more than just a charming tale. The principles that Niels Anderson intuitively understood and practically applied are the very same principles that animate the most advanced building science today. What Niels called the Earth's breath, modern engineers call passive geothermal exchange. His buried clay pipe was a primitive but highly effective ground-coupled heat exchanger. Today, similar systems, often made of high-density plastic tubing, are installed in high-performance passive houses to pre-warm incoming ventilation air, drastically reducing heating and cooling loads. Niels's understanding of the draft problem is now a cornerstone of modern building performance. The concept of creating a vacuum with combustion appliances and exhaust fans is known as depressurization. Building scientists now use sophisticated tools like blower doors to measure a home's air tightness and manometers to diagnose pressure imbalances. The solution they often prescribe for a house with a powerful stove or furnace is a dedicated make-up air system, a direct air intake that provides combustion air without depressurizing the living space, the exact solution Niels engineered with his buried pipe. His focus on a sealed, insulated building envelope to prevent heat loss through convection is the fundamental goal of modern construction, quantified with metrics like R values for insulation and ACEH, air changes per hour, for air tightness. Niels Anderson, the quiet Norwegian with knowledge from ice houses and badger dens, was practicing the core tenets of 21st century green building 100 years ahead of his time. The legacy of Niels Anderson is a powerful parable of practical wisdom. It is a story about the conflict between unthinking convention and observant, critical thought. His neighbors were not foolish men. They were simply following a script that had worked until it didn't. They relied on a brute force approach, more wood, thicker walls, without ever questioning the underlying physics of their problem. Niels, on the other hand, was a true systems thinker. He looked past the symptoms, the cold, the drafts, and diagnosed the root cause, the pressure imbalance created by the stove. His solution was elegant because it didn't just fight the cold. It changed the very system by which his house interacted with the environment. He chose not to fight the forces of nature, but to harness one of its subtle, constant principles as an ally. It stands as a testament to the enduring value of traditional knowledge, the kind passed down through generations of people living in close contact with their environment. It is a reminder that innovation does not always come from a laboratory or a university, but often from the quiet observation and methodical work of a single persistent individual who is willing to look foolish in the pursuit of a better way. The story of the buried pipe is a story of survival, of humility, and of the profound intelligence embedded in the natural world, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. In the end, the simple, invisible current of air Niels Anderson invited into his home from deep within the earth was more powerful than all the axes and all the woodpiles on the Dakota prairie.